The year was 451, and across the rolling plains of northeastern Gaul, the fate of Western civilization hung by a thread. Two massive armies faced each other in what would become the most decisive battle of the 5th century, a clash so brutal and significant that it would echo through the ages as the moment when Rome made its final stand against the forces of chaos. This is the story of the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, where an empire on the brink of collapse found the strength for one last victory, and where the most feared warlord in the world would finally meet his match. On one side stood Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, whose very name struck terror into the hearts of emperors and peasants alike. His vast army stretched across the horizon like a dark tide, comprising not only his fearsome Hun warriors, but Germanic tribes, Ostrogoths, Gepids, and countless others who had bent the knee to his overwhelming power. For decades, this man had carved a path of destruction from the steppes of Asia to the gates of Constantinople, demanding tribute from the mightiest empires and reducing proud cities to ash and memory. On the other side stood a most unlikely coalition. Roman legions marched alongside their former enemies, the Visigoths, Franks, and Burgundians. Leading this desperate alliance was Flavius Aetius, universally acclaimed as the last of the Romans, a man whose very existence embodied the complex nature of a dying empire. Born of mixed barbarian and Roman heritage, Aetius had spent his youth as a hostage among both Visigoths and Huns, learning their ways, their strengths, and most importantly, their weaknesses. Now, in the twilight of Roman power, he would use that knowledge in a gamble that would determine whether European civilization would survive or fall beneath the hooves of Hun cavalry. The road to this confrontation began not with grand strategy or imperial ambition, but with a desperate plea from a woman scorned. Justa Grata Honoria, sister to Emperor Valentinian III, had found herself trapped in a political marriage she despised. In her desperation, she committed an act that would reshape the fate of Europe. She sent her ring and a letter to Attila himself, begging for his intervention. Whether she truly intended to propose marriage or merely sought his aid in escaping her circumstances, history will never know. But Attila, ever the opportunist, saw something far greater in her message. The Hun king declared that he would accept Honoria as his bride, but not without a dowry befitting his station. That dowry, he announced, would be nothing less than half of the Western Roman Empire itself. When Valentinian naturally refused this outrageous demand, Attila had his pretext for war. The scourge of God would march west, not merely for plunder or tribute, but for conquest on a scale that would dwarf all his previous campaigns. By 451, Attila had assembled the largest army of his career. Contemporary sources speak of hundreds of thousands of warriors, though modern historians place the number closer to 100,000, still a massive force by the standards of the age. These were not merely Hun horse archers, fearsome though they were. Attila's genius lay in his ability to unite the fractured barbarian world under his banner. Ostrogothic heavy cavalry rode alongside swift Hun mounted archers. Germanic infantry marched with warriors from a dozen different tribes, each bringing their own weapons, tactics, and burning desire for Roman wealth. The invasion began in earnest as three massive columns of this multi-ethnic army rolled through Belgic Gaul like an unstoppable tide. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to smoking ruins. Refugees fled southward with tales of horror that grew more terrifying with each telling. The rich province of Aquitaine, nominally Roman but increasingly dominated by barbarian settlements, lay defenseless before this approaching storm. If Attila could overrun Gaul, all of Western Europe would be ripe for conquest. News of the invasion reached Aetius in Italy, and the last of the Romans knew that this was the moment of truth. For 20 years, he had wielded unprecedented power as the de facto ruler of the Western Empire. Serving 3 consulships and holding the rare title of patrician, he had fought continuously and successfully against rebels and hostile tribes, earning a reputation as both a brilliant general and a shrewd politician. But never had he faced a threat like this. Aetius moved with characteristic speed, gathering what forces he could, and marching rapidly from Italy into Gaul. But as he surveyed his available troops, the magnitude of his challenge became clear. His Roman legions, while disciplined and experienced, were few in number. The empire that had once fielded armies in the hundreds of thousands could now barely scrape together a fraction of that strength. If he was to have any hope of stopping Attila, he would need allies. Not just any allies, but the very barbarian kingdoms that had been Rome's enemies for generations. The most crucial of these potential allies were the Visigoths, under their king Theodoric I. The Visigothic kingdom in southwestern Gaul had been established in 418 as part of a complex arrangement with Rome, serving as a buffer between Roman territories and other barbarian groups, for influence. Now, Aetius would have decades. Romans and Visigoths had been frequent adversaries, fighting over territory, tribute, and political. Their survival depended on putting aside old grievances and facing to convince Theodoric that a common enemy. When Aetius first approached the Visigothic court, he met with skepticism and suspicion. Theodoric had learned how few troops the Roman general commanded, and initially decided it would be wiser to wait and oppose the Huns in his own lands, rather than risk his army in a joint campaign. The Visigothic king was no fool. He understood that this might well be a trap, a way for Rome to use Visigothic blood to solve a Roman problem. But Aetius had an ace up his sleeve in the form of Avitus, the former praetorian prefect of Gaul. Avitus possessed something that even the last of the Romans lacked: the personal relationships and diplomatic skills needed to navigate the complex world of barbarian politics. Through patient negotiation and careful persuasion, Avitus managed what seemed impossible. He convinced Theodoric not only to join the Roman cause, but to bring with him a significant portion of the Visigothic military might. The transformation of this diplomatic breakthrough into military reality required extraordinary organizational skills. Aetius found himself commanding not a traditional Roman army, but a coalition unlike anything seen before in European warfare. Roman legions would fight alongside Visigothic heavy cavalry. Allan mounted archers would charge beside Frankish infantry and Burgundian warriors. Each contingent brought their own weapons, tactics, languages, and loyalties. Holding such a force together would require more than military genius. It would require the political acumen of a master statesman. Aetius demonstrated both his strategic brilliance and his understanding of coalition politics in how he arranged his diverse army. The potentially unreliable Alans were placed in the center, where they could be closely monitored by both Roman and Visigothic forces. The Romans took the left wing, where Aetius could personally command them and ensure their discipline. Most crucially, the formidable Visigoths under King Theodoric were positioned on the right wing, where their heavy cavalry could deliver the decisive blow that might win or lose the entire battle. Meanwhile, Attila's massive host continued its inexorable advance through Gaul, leaving devastation in its wake. The Hun king was confident in his overwhelming numerical superiority and the terror his name inspired. He had crushed every army that dared oppose him, extracted tribute from the mightiest empires, and built his reputation on an unbroken string of victories. What could this desperate coalition of Romans and their former enemies possibly do against the might of his united barbarian horde? The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Gaul, but the future of European civilization itself. As June advanced toward its climax, the two great armies drew closer to their inevitable collision. The very earth seemed to tremble under the weight of so many marching feet, the thunder of countless hooves, and the rumble of supply wagons stretching beyond the horizon. Scouts from both sides ranged far across the countryside, bringing back reports that grew more urgent with each passing day. The clash that would shake the foundations of the known world was now mere days away. The landscape itself would play a crucial role in what was to unfold. The Catalaunian Plains, somewhere between the ancient cities of Troyes and Chalon-sur-Marne, presented a battlefield unlike any other. Rolling grasslands stretched toward distant hills, broken by streams and dotted with patches of woodland. Most significantly, a sharp ridge dominated the center of the plain, its slopes offering commanding views of the surrounding terrain. Both commanders immediately recognized that whoever controlled this high ground would hold a decisive advantage in the coming battle. Attila understood the stakes perfectly. This was no mere raid for plunder or tribute. Victory here would shatter the last organized resistance to his westward expansion and open the road to the Atlantic. The rich lands of Gaul, with their prosperous cities and fertile fields, would become the heart of a new Hun empire stretching from the Danube to the ocean. From there, he could turn his attention to the Italian peninsula and the great prize of Rome itself. The vision was intoxicating, a dream of dominion that would eclipse even the achievements of his predecessors. Yet Attila was also a pragmatist, a general who had survived and thrived through careful calculation as much as raw courage. He recognized that this coalition arrayed against him was different from the isolated enemies he had crushed in the past. These were seasoned warriors, led by commanders who understood both Roman discipline and barbarian ferocity. The battle would not be won through intimidation alone, but through superior tactics and unwavering determination. The Hun king made a fateful decision that would influence everything that followed. Rather than strike immediately upon encountering the enemy, he chose to delay the engagement until late in the afternoon. His reasoning was coldly practical. If his forces faced defeat, the approaching darkness would provide cover for a retreat. If they achieved victory, the setting sun would not matter. It was the calculation of a commander who had learned that even the mightiest army could face unexpected reverses. As the armies maneuvered for position on that fateful morning of June 20th, 451, the tension was almost unbearable. Soldiers on both sides checked their weapons for the 100th time, adjusted their armor, and offered prayers to whatever gods they served. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, as if the very heavens were holding their breath before the storm. The first crucial engagement came not in the form of a massive battle, but in a race for the commanding ridge at the center of the plain. Hun cavalry, moving with their characteristic speed and precision, swept forward to seize the high ground. But they found their path blocked by Visigothic warriors under Prince Thorismund, son of King Theodoric. The young prince had inherited his father's courage and tactical brilliance, and he was determined that the enemy would not gain the advantage of height. The fighting for the ridge was vicious and desperate. Hun horse archers peppered the advancing Visigoths with clouds of arrows, while Germanic warriors responded with volleys of javelins and the thunder of charging cavalry. The slope became slippery with blood as men fell on both sides, their bodies tumbling down the incline in the chaos of close combat. But gradually, through sheer determination and superior positioning, Thorismund's forces gained the upper hand. The Huns were driven back, leaving the vital high ground in Visigothic hands. This early success sent a surge of confidence through the coalition ranks. For too long, Attila's enemies had been intimidated by his reputation for invincibility. Now they had drawn first blood and proven that the Hun war machine could be stopped, could be hurt, could even be defeated. The psychological impact was immense, transforming nervous allies into determined warriors, ready to stake everything on the coming battle. Attila watched this reverse with calculating eyes. The loss of the ridge was significant, but not fatal. He still commanded the larger army, and his warriors had faced setbacks before, only to emerge victorious through courage and cunning. The real test would come when the full weight of his host crashed against the coalition line. Then they would see whether this unlikely alliance could hold together under the pressure of total war. As the sun reached its zenith and began its descent toward the western horizon, both armies completed their final preparations. Standards were raised, war cries echoed across the plain, and commanders made their last speeches to steel their men's resolve. The moment that would determine the fate of civilizations was at hand. King Theodoric, graying but still formidable in his war gear, rode among his Visigothic warriors with words of encouragement. These men had followed him through countless battles, had carved out a kingdom from the chaos of a collapsing empire, and had stood firm against every enemy that dared challenge their strength. Now they faced their greatest test, but they would meet it as they had always done, with courage, honor, and absolute loyalty to their king. Aetius, meanwhile, moved through the ranks of his diverse coalition with the practiced eye of a veteran commander. He spoke to Roman legionaries in Latin, addressed Frankish chiefs in their Germanic tongue, and used interpreters to communicate with Alan horsemen and Burgundian infantry. Each group brought their own strengths to the alliance, but binding them together into an effective fighting force required all of his political and military skill. The afternoon shadows were growing longer when Attila finally gave the signal his army had been waiting for. War horns sounded across the plain, their haunting notes carried on the wind like the voices of ancient spirits calling warriors to battle. The great host began to move forward, a tide of steel and flesh that seemed capable of sweeping away anything in its path. At the center of this massive formation rode Attila himself, the scourge of God, surrounded by his personal bodyguard of elite Hun warriors. His presence alone was worth thousands of ordinary soldiers, for his men believed he was blessed by the sky god of the steppes, destined to conquer the world and rule over all nations. His banner, decorated with the symbols of his victories, flew proudly above the advancing ranks. The coalition forces stood their ground with grim determination. They could see the enemy approaching like a storm cloud, could hear the thunder of hooves and the clash of weapons growing ever louder. Some men muttered prayers, others gripped their spears with white knuckles, but none broke ranks. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to falter now. The collision, when it came, was like the meeting of two natural forces, earthquake and avalanche crashing together with earth-shattering violence. The sound could be heard for miles around, a continuous roar of metal on metal, the screams of wounded horses, and the battle cries of warriors locked in mortal combat. Dust rose in choking clouds, obscuring vision and making it impossible to tell friend from enemy in the swirling melee. In the center of the line, where Aetius had positioned the Allan cavalry, the fighting reached a fever pitch of desperation. These mounted warriors, caught between the advancing Hun horde and the expectant eyes of their Roman and Visigothic allies, found themselves facing the ultimate test of loyalty. Many had served under Hun banners in previous campaigns, fighting for Attila's gold and glory. Now they rode against their former comrades, their arrows seeking targets among men who had once shared their campfires and their victories. The Alans fought with the fury of warriors who knew they had no choice but to prove themselves. Their composite bows sang deadly songs as volleys of arrows darkened the sky, while their cavalry charges struck like lightning against the Hun formations. Yet for all their skill and courage, they were slowly being pushed back by the sheer weight of numbers pressing against them. Attila had concentrated his finest troops against this weak point in the coalition line, sensing that if he could shatter the center, the entire enemy army would collapse into chaos. On the Roman left wing, Aetius commanded with the cool precision that had made him legendary. His legionaries, though few in number, represented the last flowering of Roman military discipline. These were not the raw recruits or barbarian foederati that increasingly filled imperial ranks, but professional soldiers who had learned their craft in decades of frontier warfare. They stood in perfect formation, shields locked together in the ancient testudo, their pila ready to launch at any enemy foolish enough to come within range. When the Hun cavalry struck their line, it was like waves crashing against an unbreakable shore. The Romans absorbed charge after charge, their shields deflecting arrows and their swords finding gaps in enemy armor. Aetius rode behind the front ranks, his voice cutting through the din of battle as he directed reinforcements to threatened sections and coordinated with his allied commanders. This was his masterpiece, 20 years of military experience distilled into a single afternoon of controlled violence. But it was on the right wing that the battle's fate truly hung in the balance. King Theodoric led his Visigothic warriors with the passionate intensity that had made his people the terror of southern Gaul. These were not merely soldiers fighting for pay or conquest, but free men defending their homes, their families, and their way of life. They knew that defeat here would mean slavery or death, that their children would grow up under the boot of Hun oppression if they failed to hold the line. The Visigothic charge was a thing of terrible beauty, heavy cavalry thundering across the plain with lances leveled and war cries echoing from 1,000 throats. They struck the Hun left wing with crushing force, their armored horses bowling over lighter mounted archers and their long spears piercing deep into enemy ranks. For a moment, it seemed as though they might break through entirely, carving a path of destruction that would roll up the entire Hun line. Yet Attila had not conquered half the known world by allowing single charges to determine his fate. Even as the Visigoths pressed their advantage, he was already responding with the fluid tactics that had made him legendary. Ostrogothic heavy cavalry, fighting under Hun banners, wheeled around to strike the Visigothic flank. Germanic infantry, veterans of countless battles, formed shield walls to blunt the enemy advance. The Hun war machine adapted and responded with mechanical precision. The fighting grew more brutal with each passing moment. Men slipped and fell on ground soaked with blood, their weapons torn from dying hands only to be snatched up by comrades who fought on over their corpses. Horses screamed and reared as spears found their flanks, throwing riders who were trampled underfoot by the advancing melee. The air itself seemed thick with death, choking dust mixed with the metallic scent of spilled blood and the acrid smoke of burning equipment. In the midst of this hellish chaos, King Theodoric continued to lead from the front, his sword rising and falling as he carved through enemy ranks. The Visigothic king was no longer young, his hair grey beneath his iron helm, and his movements perhaps not as swift as they had been in his youth. But his courage remained undiminished, and his presence alone was worth 1,000 ordinary warriors. Wherever Theodoric appeared, his men fought harder, stood firmer, and drove deeper into the enemy formation. Then came the moment that would define not just this battle, but the entire course of European history. As Theodoric pressed forward in pursuit of fleeing Huns, his horse stumbled on the corpse-strewn ground. The king was thrown from his saddle, landing hard among the trampled earth and scattered weapons. Before he could regain his feet, the press of battle swept over him. Some accounts say he was trampled by his own advancing cavalry, too caught up in the fury of pursuit to see their fallen leader. Others claim an Ostrogothic spear found its mark, piercing the king's armor at a joint where the metal plates met. The discovery of Theodoric's body should have broken Visigothic resistance entirely. Throughout the barbarian world, the death of a king in battle often meant the immediate collapse of his army, as warriors fled to protect their own lands and interests. But something extraordinary happened on the Catalaunian Plains. Instead of fleeing, the Visigoths fought with renewed fury, their grief transforming into a berserker rage that swept away everything in its path. Prince Thorismund, having learned of his father's death, assumed command with the natural authority of royal blood. The young prince had inherited his father's tactical brilliance and his people's fierce pride, but he brought something else to the battle: the burning desire for vengeance that could turn ordinary men into legends. Under his leadership, the Visigoths launched a devastating counterattack that drove deep into the Hun center, threatening to split Attila's army in half. The Hun king found himself in an increasingly desperate position. His left wing was crumbling under Visigothic pressure, his center was being hammered by the reformed Alan cavalry, and even his right wing was making little progress against the disciplined Roman legions. For the first time in his career, Attila faced the very real possibility of complete defeat. The aura of invincibility that had carried him from the steppes to the gates of Constantinople was beginning to crack under the strain of sustained resistance. Yet Attila had not become the scourge of God through panic or hasty decisions. Even as his army wavered on the edge of collapse, he was already planning his next move. The Hun king ordered his forces to fall back toward their fortified camp, a massive circle of wagons that had been prepared for exactly this contingency. It was a fighting withdrawal, each step contested with desperate fury, but it was a withdrawal nonetheless. As darkness began to fall across the blood-soaked plain, the nature of the battle changed completely. What had been a massive clash of armies became a series of smaller, more vicious engagements as both sides struggled to maintain contact in the gathering gloom. The ridge that had been so hotly contested that morning became a no-man's land where scattered groups of warriors hunted each other through the shadows, guided more by sound than sight. Prince Thorismund, leading a pursuit of fleeing Huns, found himself separated from his main force in the confusion. The young Visigothic commander, his blood still running hot from battle and grief, pressed forward with only a small band of followers. In the darkness, with smoke and dust obscuring landmarks, it was easy to lose direction. When Thorismund finally called a halt to regroup, he discovered to his horror that he had somehow blundered into the Hun camp itself. Surrounded by enemies and far from help, the Visigothic prince faced a situation that would have meant certain death for most men. But Thorismund was no ordinary warrior. He was the son of a king, trained from childhood in the arts of war and leadership. More importantly, he carried with him the fury of a people who had just lost their beloved monarch. The prince and his men fought their way out of the enemy camp in a running battle that left dozens of Huns dead and added another layer to the growing legend of Visigothic courage. The night brought a strange quiet to the Catalaunian Plains, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant sounds of both armies regrouping. Attila's forces had reached the safety of their wagon circle, but they were trapped there like animals in a pen. The coalition army controlled the field, could deny the Huns access to water and forage, and had proven that the supposedly invincible enemy could indeed be beaten. For the first time in his career, the Scourge of God faced the prospect of siege rather than conquest. The dawn that broke over the Catalaunian Plains revealed a field transformed by blood and sacrifice. Where the day before had witnessed the clash of civilizations, now lay the aftermath of Rome's final victory. Attila the Hun, the Scourge of God whose name had terrorized emperors and peasants alike, found himself trapped within his circle of wagons, his aura of invincibility shattered forever. The coalition had achieved what seemed impossible, turning former enemies into brothers in arms and proving that even the mightiest conqueror could be stopped. Yet Aetius, in his wisdom, chose not to deliver the killing blow. Understanding that the complete destruction of Attila's forces would leave him vulnerable to his now powerful allies, he allowed the Hun king to retreat eastward. It was a decision born of political necessity rather than mercy, one that would echo through history as both brilliant strategy and missed opportunity. Within 3 years, both great commanders would be dead. Attila from a nosebleed on his wedding night, Aetius assassinated by the very emperor he had served so faithfully. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains stands as more than just Rome's last great victory. It represents the moment when unity triumphed over chaos, when courage overcame overwhelming odds, and when the course of European civilization was decided by men willing to die for something greater than themselves. The fields of Gaul had witnessed the end of one age and the birth of another, forever remembered as the day Rome stood firm against the darkness and lit a torch that would burn for generations to come.